Welcome to 1202, the podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bits in between.
And welcome to this episode of 1202, the Human Factors Podcast, with me, your host, Barry Kirby. Before we get underway, just to highlight, as usual, a couple of podcast updates. Next month, in April, there's going to be a mixture of random stuff going on because of the ergonomics conference. So we hope to be doing some live streaming, some interviews, and quite frankly, some random stuff. So keep an eye out on the social feeds and see what happens. I'm hoping that we might have some live bar chat, if anybody's willing to talk to me over a pint, as well as basically getting people's input and people's thoughts about how that conference is going. So let's just see what happens. Also on Human Factors Cast, our sisters podcast, they had a town hall event with the leadership of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, the HFES. And so I thoroughly recommend that you delve into their socials to see what the future looks like from their perspective. And also, just as a slight caveat on this, I've upgraded some of the IT infrastructure literally today. So fingers crossed I get everything sorted, or this could all get a bit interesting. If there's some really random cuts in the broadcast, then that's why. But so far, fingers crossed, it's all going well. So keeping our fingers crossed, let's talk about today's episode. One of the most frightening and devastating things that I think can happen is a fire, be that in the home or the workplace. And according to Home Office statistics, there was over 35,000 dwelling fires in the UK in 2019-2020, which led to 285 fire-related deaths. 67% of those are attributed to human causes. And before we get into the whole thing around human causes and human error, let's just play along with this. But them human causes are sort of highlighted as things like negligence or literally playing with fire. But the most common time for fire incidents is between sort of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. And so therefore the need to alert residents of homes that there is a problem, then the smoke alarm is becoming a common feature in every home. In fact, it's a mandated feature in every home. But are they as smart as they could be? And more importantly, how many have the batteries simply taken out of them, which I think we've all been guilty of at one time or another? Or are they also more used to tell everybody when dinner's ready? Because that might just be a reflection on my own cooking. But fire is not the only concern. Things like carbon monoxide poisoning is very much now a silent killer, and it accrues over time. So it's one of these things that builds up in the bloodstream. And so the use of carbon monoxide alarms is becoming more prevalent too. So with the advent of IoT, which, as for those people who listen often, is something that I'm really interested in and looking at greater exploitation of, and also how to get a better understanding of how people react in emergency situations like this, I'm really pleased to be joined by Nick Rutter, who is the co-founder and chief product officer at Fire Angel. So, Nick, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast.
It's absolutely fantastic to be on a podcast, Barry.
Cool. Not everybody says that, so that's a great start. So before we get into sort of the whole fire piece itself, let's find out a bit more about your good self, if you don't mind. So you're the chief product officer and the co-founder at Fire Angel. So could you tell us a bit more about Fire Angel itself and then what you do in that role?
Okay, so Fire Angel is a designer and a manufacturer of domestic safety solutions, so predominantly smoke alarms, heat alarms, carbon monoxide alarms, aimed specifically at dwellings, so at domestic premises. We've been in the market for just over 20 years, trading just over 20 years. During that period, we've sold over 70 million products. Wow. So there's a huge amount of our products in people's homes, protecting their homes. Predominantly, they have been standalone products, but more commonly now becoming interlinked systems within the home, or moving forward IoT technology, where we've had a huge focus over the last 10 years around IoT technology.
So you've been involved in that. Like I say, you're the co-founder of the company. How did you get into that in the first place? Because that's quite a distinguished bit of career. How did you fall into that?
Yeah, it was an interesting journey. So I trained as an industrial designer. Mm-hmm. I ended up in Hong Kong working for Philips in their portable audio design studios. And I decided with my co-founder, Sam, that we were going to start a business. And we created a business model before we decided what we were going to do. And that business model was plastic electronics goods, consumer electronics, because I knew that world from working for Philips.
Yeah.
Global products, so we had volume. Going into a market where we didn't feel there were any strong brands, so we could create a brand. And a product set where there was room for improvement. You need to innovate to create a startup business within an existing commercial area. And we started off, so we decided we were going to start a company. We were looking at lots of different domestic electronics products, from TVs to kettles to stereos. And we saw a smoke alarm. It had the cover open and it had no batteries in it. And we started to speak to people about smoke alarms, and everybody we spoke to had a bad user experience.
Yeah.
So Fire Angel really is a business that was created to build a brand around fire safety, but from the starting point of bad user experience.
Wow, I really like the idea that you knew you wanted to do something, but you weren't quite sure what. But yet, then you were able to sit and sort of, you found a problem, then really ran with it. Was that not a scary proposition? So having come out, I mean, obviously you've had the experience of working with Philips and things, but then to be able to just sort of turn around and say, right, we're going to go it alone and create something from scratch that's going to work on a global level. Was that scary or just, or how did that make you feel? What was the inspiration? Why?
Well, obviously we were a lot younger then and very, very enthusiastic. I think my experience working in Hong Kong had given me the confidence to be able to do that from a personal perspective. And we did work with an incubator at Coventry University. So Coventry University, this was the late 90s, had got an incubator scheme. We got some European funding. And that helped get our initial business plan and research funded, so we could go out and raise some money to actually, to get our first product to market. Took over £1 million worth of investment. It's an expensive space to develop products in. So we were just fortunate in that we found this facility within this incubator unit at Coventry University.
That's fascinating. And is it a sort of space where, obviously, with the nature of being fire, is it deemed as a safety critical space? Given, and it sounds an odd thing to say, but you sort of see smoke alarms, that type of thing, sort of being, varying prices and things like that. Do you have a set of legislation, specific around that you have to work with?
Absolutely, yes. So without getting into the really boring details, there is a harmonised European standard which the UK is still part of. So if you put it on the market and you call it a smoke alarm in Europe, it has to meet this specific standard. And it's an area where people coming from other sectors of consumer electronics, where to put a product on the market, you have to make sure it's electrically safe and it doesn't interfere with other devices. And that's normally where it stops. We have to do basically a year's worth of independent certification, our factories audited. So it's a very, very regulated area.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. Wasn't aware of that at all. That's really interesting. Before we get started, and I realize I'm jumping into the main topic here, but before we get into that, obviously, over the past couple of years, we've had the pandemic piece that we're just coming, hopefully, touch wood, coming out the far side of one way or another. How have you found working during the COVID? Have you been working from home, or how's that work for you?
I was one of the really lucky people in that myself and my other half live in a reasonable sized house in a village. We could walk the dogs from home, although she works from home already, so we ended up with one of us working in the kitchen. We're fortunate in that our home has an office, in fact, which is incredibly rare. So we were really lucky, and I lasted until about the middle of May 2020, the first lockdown, working from home, and then just said, look, this isn't working anymore. I'm going to have to start going into the office.
Yeah.
Often I'd drive and be the only person in the building, but work from the building. So from that perspective, I learned that I like working with people. I like having some delineation between my home space and my workspace.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I didn't think the move to working using Teams and Zoom and this type of technology would be particularly successful. And sort of shame on me, because it's worked incredibly well. we now have a hybrid working policy at Fire Angel. So I tend to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, and that's really convenient, and I wouldn't want to go back to the old way of working. So, I suppose as both a designer and an entrepreneur, you tend to be glass half full. And for all the horror of the pandemic, I think there's a huge amount of positives in that it's shaken up the way that we live and the way that we work. And there will be positives for all of us in the future as a result of that.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting, isn't it? I think lots of different companies are taking hugely different approaches to it. In terms of, yes, it's great, or they just want to get back to the way it was. And I very much think that it's very much a Pandora's box now, because I think that the old adage of people won't work effectively at home, or they'll be just sat around and drinking coffee and not actually being productive. I think that's been slain, as it were. People are productive out, but then it's people having that ability to sort of turn around and say, well, actually, I work better in this way. Can we, accommodate? I think that hybrid working is going to be very much a way forward.
I think it's a very easy decision for companies, because the recruitment market in the UK, at least, but I know globally, is the most challenging it's been in over 20 years I've been in business. If you're not offering hybrid working, you're not going to get good staff. So if you want a good business, you've got to offer it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair comment. I think it's the workers have now got they've had that taste of knowing what they can do. And there's a really good graphic going around, I think, on LinkedIn at the moment about what used to be the 9 to 5 is now the when am I most productive, and that type of thing. So no, that's really interesting. So we're going to get to the main topic in a second, but in have yourself a bit of a glass of water or something while we take this quick break.
You are listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. We wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you for your support. You can help further by rating us through your podcast provider, sharing us through social media, and telling your friends and colleagues. Let's work together in raising awareness of the value in putting users at the centre of what we do.
And welcome back. And I'm here talking with Nick Rutter about fire, and in particular the use of technology to help save people's lives. So, Nick, let's start from the beginning. What are you're mainly focused in domestic dwellings and things like that. So, what are the most common causes of house fire?
The most common actual cause is around cooking. Shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It's the room in the house where we get things very hot or set fire to them intentionally. So, it's no surprise whatsoever. So that is by far the highest. Smoking, considering the huge reduction in smoking, that we've seen over the last 30 years, smoking is still a disproportionate factor. And then there are areas around electrical product faults, things like that, down the list. But cooking still is over 40% from a cause. And we see this internationally. It normally drops out about 50% of fires actually start in the kitchen. However, it's less severe from a fatality perspective, only accounts in the UK for sort of around 10% of fatalities, because a lot of fires tend to happen at night that go on to become fatal fires. And
so if the most fatal ones are happening at night, presumably that's because people are asleep and you're having to get them out. How do people normally react in that sort of situation? What's their what's the behaviour that we can expect from them?
And I think this is a really interesting area, because when you look at our products as a product set, fortunately fires are relatively rare. So 99.9% of our end users' interaction with our products is installing them, decommissioning them at the end of their life, or dealing with them if there's a fault with the device, or more commonly, there's a situation like cooking, where you've set the smoke alarm off, which most users see as a nuisance, because they know they've not got a fire and they don't want the smoke alarm to be making a load of noise. Yet actually the smoke alarm's doing exactly what it's intended to do, to save the smoke within the property. what actually happens in those situations where there is a fire is really not very well understood. And it's an area of huge interest to us. And when, I know we'll talk about IoT, there's fantastic opportunities around the use of IoT in understanding that.
Yeah.
What we do know is often people's memories of what is happening is very poor. So a good example, we had a situation which was slightly worrying where there was a report of a serious fire and that our alarms didn't work.
Right.
It obviously went through a full investigation, and when the fire investigator listened to the 999 call, you could hear our smoke alarms on the call in the background going off.
Right.
However, the person who made the 999 call was absolutely adamant that the smoke alarms didn't go off. It's a stressful situation, and you will know that people's memory in stressful situations can become incredibly poor. If you then take a situation where somebody's asleep, they're woken up, they're disorientated, then the house is full of smoke, there are so many unknowns there. And if you use a parallel to the cutting edge of safety in an area where there's been a huge amount of research from a human factors perspective, like aviation, you've got a black box. And the black box has been the unlocking mechanism to allowing those safety improvements to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't, as an industry, had that black box until we launched a product in 2010, which was very innovative in quite a simple way. It had effectively a memory of previous events that we designed purely to help our technical support team if somebody phoned up with a fault. However, we then started to realise, as we got a few million of those products into the marketplace, and as some were in fires and we got them back through fire investigations, we suddenly realised we'd inadvertently created that black box around domestic fire.
Right. So using that black box then, is that being able to basically shape what you do and shape how you deliver your product?
Yeah, so it was around the time that we were starting to work on our Internet of Things solution. So around 2013, 2014. So we're specifying, we're developing this IoT solution around fire safety. And one of our engineers who was doing a fire investigation for us. So we've had a policy for 15 years that if one of our alarms is involved in a serious event, we will provide a free forensic report on that alarm. We see it as part of our responsibility more than a service as a brand. And an engineer who'd done a number of these reports, but with this new product that had got this memory in it, said to me, I'm seeing a really interesting trend in these alarms coming back in fires. And I was reading a lot around the time about big data and the power of big data. And suddenly it just sort of switched. It's like, wow, that's really interesting. Let's understand that. And that's led on to create a product that we call Predict. It's completely unique to Fire Angel. And we've actually got international patents on it. That's, we've proven it's unique. And that, using an IoT system, can potentially prevent fires even happening in the first place, and all by spotting patterns of human behaviour.
That's really interesting. So we talk about the different products, and you're throwing around a few different names. Can you just give us a quick rundown then of the different technologies that's part of your catalogue against in this space?
So from a sensing perspective, if it's fire, there are a number of different sensing technologies available. I'm not going to go into sort of the detail of them because we'll be here all day. But when I got into the industry, there was a technology called ionisation. And if you've still got a smoke alarm that goes off every time you burn the toast, you've got an old ionisation alarm, and go out and replace it with a new one, because it will stop that happening. Yeah. We now use a more sophisticated multi-sensor technology across all our mid and premium products. So that's looking at smoke in a property, but it's also looking at spikes in ambient temperature. So it's an intelligent technology. We've got a similar intelligent technology we call Thermistech for use in kitchens, which looks at potentially a cooking fire. But then on the back of that, so that's the core fire sensing technology.
Yeah.
On the back of that, we've got a number of different solutions, from mains-powered products, battery-powered products, interconnected within the property. Now is nearly all done wirelessly. It's now a requirement from this month. It's law in Scotland that all properties have got to have interconnected smoke alarms and a heat alarm in the kitchen. So Scotland's really gone out there and gone to an incredibly high level of compliance. But once you've got wirelessly interconnected products within the property, you can then put a gateway in and turn it into an IoT solution. And that then opens up the potential of using technologies like Fire Angel Predict, which can pinpoint that high-risk behaviour.
So what sort of, that segues us really nicely into that piece around the value of IoT here. So what sort of behaviours are you able to predict? What sort of thing, what are indicators that you're playing with?
Well, what we realised is that having got quite a number of alarms back where we could pull out historical data from the alarm that have been in serious fires is, there are broadly two types of domestic fire. There are completely accidental fires like an electrical fault, which sets fire to a property. And then there's the human side of it, the lifestyle-related fires. And the people who are having lifestyle-related fires normally don't just have a one-off event. It's actually quite difficult to start a fire. And if you, for example, you've got a wood burner or an open fire at home, everybody who's listening to this and who's lived with a fire at home will have tried to light a fire and it's gone out. So you try and create this perfect triangle of fire, and you're not successful. So actually starting a fire at home can be quite difficult. And what we realised is that some people it sounds a dreadful thing to say, but they were trying so hard that they got successful. That people who were having serious fires, there was a pattern of smaller events going back days or weeks or months before the fire. So that was our starting point, understanding, well, what are the root causes of those? So we know, alcohol is a big factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As are, drug abuse or illegal drug use is another factor. Any mental health issues, we're seeing fire deaths in the UK starting to plateau, and a big factor of that is ageing population and issues around basically mental condition and issues like Alzheimer's.
Right.
Leaving cooking on or burning cooking, and considering that's the root cause of 50% of fires, it's not a surprise that that's a big factor.
Yeah.
But our Predict technology is more sophisticated than saying, there might be a cooking fire and that's an issue, because we look at the response of the residents. So if somebody happens to not be a great cook and maybe have a badly sighted smoke alarm, they may set that smoke alarm off cooking quite frequently. But if they then go and press a reset button on it in a reasonably timely fashion, we know that that's relatively low risk behaviour.
Yeah.
The flip side is somebody, they've maybe been to the pub. We all do that. They've had a few too many, and I've definitely been there. But come home, decide, I think I'm going to make chips, fall asleep. It's the kind of the stereotypical example that the industry refers to. Someone coming home from the pub, deciding to start cooking, falling asleep in front of the TV, and the smoke alarms are going off. They're not reacting, and they're not reacting quickly enough. There's a really serious situation. So these are the type of factors, and we've got actually another product that's in development at the moment, which will allow us to get a much tighter understanding of what are the cause of those Predict events that we're measuring with Predict.
So are you able to get that information back in a way that you can then, I guess, how do you use that information in a proactive way? How are you getting that back and feeding that back into the next product cycle or the product lifestyle? Well,
from a safety perspective, so the way the Predict system works, it looks at every device on the Fire Angel platform.
Right.
So we're approximately 100,000 devices, all connected. It's looking for this pattern of high risk behaviour. If it sees that pattern, it then creates a predict notification. And based on how you've set the platform up, a good example will be if you're a housing association, we can get you in contact with your local fire and rescue service, community fire safety department, and they may accept predict triggers. So if somebody's showing this high risk behaviour, they can go around and do a safe and well visit, get in the property, try and understand what's happening and understand why this person is exhibiting this high risk behaviour. So while we're going through that learning process of what are the root causes, the key is using that information to create an intervention, getting somebody into the property who is a fire safety professional who can understand, okay, so we've got a smoker, there's evidence that probably we've got somebody who's excessively using alcohol. Hoarding is a really interesting factor. To quote a UK chief fire officer who spent most of his career in fire investigation, he said, I'm not trying to position anything by this statement, but I've never seen a fatal fire in a tidy house in over 20 years. But for all kinds of reasons. So then you look at hoarding. Well, why is hoarding a risk? Well, you've got more fuel in the property, so that's a risk. But actually, the fact that somebody's hoarding in the first place is an indication there could be mental health issues, which are a secondary risk. So you do tend to see in fire this almost exponential increase in certain groups' risk, and often high-risk people tend to be in multiple groups rather than just a single high-risk group.
Yeah, no, that's really, really powerful, isn't it? Because certainly with my interaction with fire service in the past, one of the biggest things budgetary they were looking for was the ability to go and educate. Residents about the fire risks in their home, and they wanted more and more budget to be able to go and do fire safety checks over and above, the newest spangly piece of kit for the on the fire engine, and it was because of exactly that, and the ability to go and target that into people who you can, from your sort of technology, to be able to identify that's got to be hugely powerful, not only for for yourself and driving that technology forward, but for every single fire service. It allows them to target their resources really, really effectively.
Yeah, and I think when you look particularly at the housing industry, so there are 4 million social housing properties in the UK, and some of those housing associations have got a lot have got tens of thousands of properties. The big ones are close to 100,000 properties, which gives them a big challenge from a responsibility and safety perspective. So to have a product that effectively gives you an automated real-time stratification of risk of where your high risk sits within those properties, and allows you to use your budget in a more focused way in order to focus on the risk and to be able to monitor the risk as well, because risk isn't a consistent thing. And another area that if you speak to people like fire and rescue services, relationships are a really interesting factor in fire risk. So often you may have a relatively low risk property, and then there's a change in relationship. Somebody new moves into the property who's of a totally different risk.
Right.
And that's quite that's an identified risk that the fire and rescue services understand. So another element that we look at as part of Predict is a sudden change in behaviour, because that's an indication that something's moved.
So moving forward then, I mean, obviously I'm really interested in this, in the human factors of behaviour and how we use them IoT technologies to do that. What if we could pick one or maybe one or two either bits of technology or whatever, what can the development of your technology help people do the most in order to keep them safe?
I think, first of all, recognising that the behaviour is an issue. As you say, education is a big factor. A lot of people have, we've got safer as a society. So, you look at fire deaths over the last 20 years in the UK, and they're down around 50%. So, the fire and rescue services in the UK on an international standing are incredibly progressive. A lot of other countries' fire and rescue services we want longer ladders, we want faster fire engines. And I don't know what it is about the National Fire Chiefs Council and UK Fire and Rescue Services. They just woke up 20 years ago to the power of prevention and the power of being proactive. So we're really fortunate in the UK in that we have that. So by being able to understand where the risk's happening, there's lots of solutions that we can introduce. So for somebody who's maybe hard of hearing and they didn't know the alarms were going off, a lot of people are hard of hearing and are a bit in denial about it. We can have a deaf alert. There are lots of solutions around cooking safety that can be introduced. And unfortunately, in some circumstances, it's not just around technology. There may be people who just aren't safe to be living alone anymore, and they're possibly living in a housing block with lots of other people within that property. So there's the intervention side of it is very, very key. But specifically on the technology side, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, we've shipped over 70 million products. But nearly all of those products we've shipped and we've waved goodbye to them as they've left the warehouse, and we don't get them back. So all of a sudden, to have this window into the behaviours of our products in the field is the biggest single innovation opportunity the industry's had.
So I'm assuming then that with all this new insight data and things like that, that universities and them sort of organisations must be chomping at the bit and battering your door down to get hold of that data to be able to get them sort of insights. Is that the case or not?
Not at the moment. No, it's not the case. It's something I'd be very, very keen. If any of the listeners are interested in doing research around this, it is something we'd be really interested in participating in, because we still understand so little. There's so much that can be done. It's not a new problem, domestic fire. It's a very, very old problem. And then you use, again, because it's a good parallel, the parallel of aviation safety. Aviation is quite new as an industry relative to what we deal with.
Yeah.
And yet they've understood the problems and dealt with them because of the magnitude of things going wrong. They've dealt with them in a relatively short space of time, and they've had the technology to do it. The level of technology that they've had has historically been out of reach for our industry. But because of particularly IoT, suddenly we're getting that technology within our reach. So we are only now getting the kind of the dawning of the ability to harvest this information.
So it's not often we get that sort of exclusive. So if there's anybody listening who's wanting to get into that data and basically look at that human behaviour aspect in a window that we haven't seen before, that sounds like an open invitation. So I suggest that somebody jumps on it. No, that's been really, really fascinating. And I think the ability to come back and perhaps talk about this again in the future to see how it's going, I think would be very much high on my agenda. So that's really, really cool. Before we say goodbye, obviously we now do these final three questions, which is to find a bit more about yourself and sort of what drives things a bit. So we've got a really posh name for it. We call it the final three. So the first one really is around, what do you read? So what's a book or a paper or something that you keep on going back to time and time again?
I have to say, I can't think of anything specific. I could lie and say it's my copy of Body Space from university in 1992 that I dig out because I'm so into the ergonomics that I did. It's not.
Well, I'm disappointed.
I think there's so much information available on the internet now. I always use the internet as a first first port of call looking at information. The other one, and again, it's quite boring, but because of the nature of our industry, there's a number of different standards. So BS 5839 Part 6, which has got a lovely name, that's the guidelines for domestic fire safety systems in the UK.
Right.
So whenever we're looking at doing something different or innovative or introducing a new technology, that's sort of our starting point about how the technology can be applied.
So I'm sure everybody's now running up for that standard. So if you could go back in time a bit, what advice would you give to younger Nick?
Sort of depends how long you've got, because that could be long in the whole podcast. I think to boil it down into a little soundbite. Firstly, to trust your gut feel, and then to stick to your guns afterwards. I think, I started this business when I was 26, and by my own admission, didn't know anything about anything. But actually, we got a vision about what we were doing. And as you go through your career, lots of people will tell you that this is the way that we do things and the way we should do things. And actually, I think if you've got a view on what you're doing, if you have a vision and you enforce that vision and you stick to that vision at all of the costs, that's the best thing that you can do.
I couldn't agree more. Just go with your gut feel fundamentally. I like that a lot. Who would you suggest we interview next? Who would you like to listen to being interviewed on?
The person I'd like to listen to being interviewed is Matthew Said, who wrote a book called Black Box Thinking.
Okay.
I studied ergonomics at university, so I knew a little bit. I'd done, I think, one module, so I understood a little bit about ergonomics, being a product designer. However, Black Box Thinking is a book all about how organisations deal with failure, and it was a real eye-opener to me. And I think what it opened up is the psychological side of human factors as opposed to the physical side. And actually how complex. We all think we are rational. We talk about being rational, and actually the way that we behave as a society is often irrational more than it is rational. And I think understanding how we behave is a really key starting point. So I'd really recommend either reading that book if you've not read the book, because it's a fantastic book. But yeah, Matthew Said, I think will be really interesting.
Cool. No, we shall chase that one down. So thank you very much for your time for talking us through Fire Angel Technologies and really giving us that insight about how you're taking IoT and giving us an insight that we've never had before. And I just reiterate, if anybody is interested in that sort of research, then jump on the opportunity, because I think it sounds like there is an opportunity here to solve a really old but a really really prevalent problem. All your details are going to be available in the show notes. But if anybody wants to find out more about Fire Angel Technology, what's the best way of doing that?
Just go to our website. So it's fireangel.co.uk. It's got lots of information about the different products and solutions we provide.
That's fantastic, and I'll make sure that link is in the notes as well. So just before we disappear, just a reminder that the Ergonomics Conference is on next month. It is split into 2 sessions, if you weren't aware. So there's going to be a virtual session on the 11th and 12th of April, where we're covering all topics on sustainability, automation, defence, and things like that. And on the evening of the 11th will be the CIHF AGM as well. And then there's going to be a physical side to it on the 25th and 26th of April, which in Birmingham, where we're going to be looking at aviation, well-being, healthcare, tools, and non-technical skills, amongst a bunch of other stuff. And more importantly, there'll be a bar. I'm going to be presenting in the sustainability session in the first virtual session. And we're going to have an entire piece on that, which I'm really quite excited by. And then we're also taking the podcast on tour to the physical event, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast. So we hope to have lots of people's thoughts and feedback on all of that sessions. So all it remains for me to say is to say thank you for engaging with us today, and we shall see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions, and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.